The institutions of racism in the United States have been around as long as the United States of America. And the struggle to change the policies that come from this are something that you have to be relentless about, because the habit of insulting black folk is a national habit that's deeply ingrained in the social consciousness of the country. You know, they think they just have a right to do it. So vigilance, eternal vigilance, because the country is not accustomed to treating black folk as human beings. Based upon the long years of slavery, there's an adjustment that has been made, but you cannot assume that adjustment has perpetuity, because there are people who are ready to cancel it at any moment that they can have an opportunity to. That's the reality of our existence.
Mr. Odell is the only person that we've had in the organization who has been called before committee, and I might say that he was not convicted of anything. He has not been convicted. And in our investigation, we found no evidence of Mr. Odell having any connection with the Communist Party after certainly 1956. No connection whatsoever. We could not find it, and we went so far as to go to the Justice Department to deal with this very problem.
There was a member of the FBI that followed me around for about 10 years, up until the time Dr. King was assassinated. He didn't follow me every day, but he might show up at any other time, you know, or I would be in my living room, and my buddy and Jim Campbell and I were staying together, and we were up on the 3rd floor, and you could look out the window, and there was a pay station down there. And you could look out the window at a certain time of evening, and then we'd see a gray Volkswagen would come, pull up, and phone our knobs, and the phone's gonna ring in a few minutes. And it was, sure enough, it would. And that's the FBI checking and seeing if I'm home. I didn't answer the phone. But you know, that kind of harassment is one that does two things. You adjust to it because you know it's part of the political reality, but also it gives you an assessment of what people can get away with in the United States, you know, in the name of being a democracy. Now, that's like I said before, that's an invasion of your rights. It's a lot of things. But you decide that you understand that, and so you don't let it worry you. My parents were divorced, and they both agreed that my grandparents could do it because they were stable, and you know, and I grew up in a fine home, the only grandchild. And I was only grandchild for a long time, so you know, I got along like a fat rat. I mean, you know, he was the first black janitor hired in Detroit. That's, you know, we could just get certain types of jobs. He got a job at the Duffield Branch Library on the Boulevard, and we lived 1 block from the Boulevard. Blacks couldn't live on the Boulevard, but 1 block over was Scotton Avenue, and we lived at 6404 Scotton Avenue. Lewis for the old 1-2. We sit out on the front porch and listen to Joe Louis knock out somebody. I mean, you know, and you'd hear the whole fight walking down the street. That's Detroit. It's not Detroit today, but the Detroit that I grew up in. Good school, ranked, my high school, Northwestern in Detroit, was named number 9 in the United States of America. Quality education. I had an uncle was a life member of the NAACP, but he said they were too slow. This is 1970s. He said the NAACP was too slow. So he said I joined Corps. He said I would have joined the Panthers, but I'm too old. There were 6 black folks who sued the city of Miami for the right of blacks to play the municipal golf course, and 3 of those 6 were members of my family. My uncle, my father, and one of my cousins. I first experienced segregation when I went south to go to college, okay? And I saw what it was. You couldn't, wait a minute, you know? Now, Detroit wasn't perfect, but man, you couldn't do nothing down there but just get out the white people's way. I mean, like, you know what I mean? I entered the Merchant Marines from New Orleans. You know, I'd been down there in college, and then I went into the Merchant Marines after 2 years. Well, I was in the largest maritime union, the National Maritime Union. I had 100,000 members in it. You know, working together. An injury to one is an injury to all. Everybody has a responsibility to make the union strong. So the best unions in the country, any part of the contract that gets violated, you take job action. Job action meant close down the city. It didn't mean throwing no rock through no window. It didn't mean hurting nobody. It meant the operation stopped because the workers did not continue. I learned that from the trade union, from NMU. So my point is, the labor movement introduced nonviolent direct action before the nonviolent direct action movement did. It just as a matter of sequence. I'm not trying to put one against the other. That's not the point. But you know what I mean? If you was in a good union, you knew what nonviolent direct action was about. It's called a strike. It's got a different name. It's not called a nonviolent direct action. It's called a strike. The strike is a nonviolent direct action, and that's where I learned it. I don't believe that capitalism is the last word. And my family have done pretty well under capitalism. I mean, you know, I've got two of my relatives, you know, my father and my uncle had nice businesses and so forth and so on. But that still does not mean that there should not be a social area of wealth distribution so that you don't have a lot of people that are hungry or haven't got clean water or can't afford to send their kid to college. You know, no, I don't believe in that kind of democracy, and because that's not democracy, that's capitalism. And so I have no investment in the perpetuation of capitalism per se, you know, because my great grandfather was a slave and he left slavery under capitalism to join the Union Army to fight for his freedom. And that's where I get my point of reference from. I have no, and so I don't care what they say about the Communist Party. The Communist Party was the most active movement in the country in the fight against racism in the ranks of the working class. No other party did what they did. No other party accomplished what they did in winning the working class over to a non-racist position. And I am proud that I was a small part of that tradition because, I mean, you know, all black folk benefited from that. There were one or two places where I could have possibly got messed up where the police were looking for me when I was in the Communist Party and I didn't show up because I found out they were there. That was also because down south, if the police get you, you don't know what you're going to end up because they don't have any, there's no accountability. So I didn't run that risk. House Un-American Activities Committee was held a hearing in Atlanta. And the subject was communism in the South. So I was summoned along with Carl Braden and 3 or 4 other people. I was working in Montgomery at the time. So, you know, upon return, I stopped over in Birmingham overnight. And it just happened that the cab driver that I took came in on this side where you're elevated and you come down into, and then you'll be passing my heart and my house on the right. And as he was coming down that hill, he said, "Oh, the police are waiting on somebody down here." But if he hadn't called my attention to it, wonder who the police is waiting for down here. And I said, "Oh, you don't," not just like said to myself, "Oh, you don't know, huh?" But so we had to kind of keep kind of quick. So once I told him, just keep on, because I got to go out to see these other people. Then I laid down on the back seat. So as passing, they just saw a cab driver. And that's the way I got out of there. The landlady said they were looking for me like a mad dog. They were all up under the porch and so forth. Now, that's the kind of thing black folk live with every day. The police had uh, carte blanche, is what they do. And you could never tell how a situation like that would end. The House Un-American Activities Committee is holding hearings on communism. Well, they know what that means. So if I was summoned to an event, the Congress discussing communism, this is the police looking at a communist in Montgomery. What a communist, I mean, this was powerful, of course. I mean, like you say, you don't know what would happen. Maybe nothing, and maybe something tragic. But it was in their hands, that's the point. You'd find out about it afterwards. Well, I was deciding not to be no afterwards, because I had some other things I wanted to do. In my experience in the Communist Party, there were people who believed that that black Americans would never have equality under capitalism until socialism was established. I can understand them thinking that, but when I saw this movement coming of nonviolent direct action that Dr. King and Core and SNCC I said, well, that may not be true. We may get desegregation before we get socialism. And so I felt that since you, in a lifetime, you only have one source of energy, I said, well, I think I'll try the civil rights movement and do what I can to enhance that. Let's see how far that can go towards getting rid of segregation. You see what I'm saying? And that was the basis for me saying no thanks in terms of remaining in the Communist Party, because the conditions under which you could get involved in civil rights is, they didn't want the FBI following them around. So they said, well, no, we don't care what but we can't have people who are already communists. And well, then, hey. So my point was that I was going to invest some serious time and energy into this civil rights movement and see what its potential is in ending segregation. I worked with Dr. King from 1960 to 1963, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, you see. In the SCLC, I had two responsibilities. I was in charge of fundraising for the organization with benefits like Frank Sinatra and Rat Pack and so on. But they needed somebody in each organization specifically turned to voter registration. So I said, okay, I'll take it on too. So I took on the second job. I was the only person in SCLC out of about 70 staff that had two jobs. One fundraising out of New York, the other directing our voter registration work in 5 southern states. He didn't act like he was up and above, whether he was the primary personality, and the person that was guiding the work in terms of the things that he came through his thoughtfulness and interpretation. But we were almost like a family. We were all doing the same work. He was a good listener, but he was a very pleasant person, and he understood it that we were all working for the same goals, and he respected that. But he wasn't working for Martin Luther King. We were all working for the elimination of the insult of segregation and for a better society in America, because we had ideas beyond what America is, even today. Well, Mrs. King said, and this is her way, she said he trusted you greatly, and therefore he didn't put a lot of time into supervising you, and so to speak, and asking you what you're doing, because he could see the results. I reported to the office in terms of the fundraising. This was direct mail fundraising. Well, they were getting funds in that they knew what the source of it was. And then we had we would have regular meetings about every 2 months on the voter registration thing. And I would give my report on the whole program. Well, I was responsible for a team that each of 5 organizations had teams of people that would work in they had assigned to several states. There were a variety of impediments. Um, they would mess with your mail and say they had no record that you lived where this is where you signed a document that was your address. Um, there were impediments with regard to if you went to the meetings of SCLC in some cities, the police would take down license numbers where your car was parked and then find out on the basis of that where you worked and turn it over to your employer. And there were many instances where people lost their jobs for being at one of our Monday night meetings. Um, so, and then of course you're supposed to read and interpret the Constitution. Uh, uh, you know, asking blacks to pass so-called tests that white people didn't have to pass. Anything to discourage you from going down there and registering to vote, so that you could be part of the next election. So they never ceased to. The people in charge of that never ceased to try to create forms of intimidation that would keep the black vote at a certain level because they didn't want black representatives to emerge. And of course, we did manage to break down that. In other words, there are a lot of blacks who've been elected to state legislatures and city councils and mayors. But up until the mid 60s, that was a very rare development. Enough people were intimidated by the local stuff, from you losing their job or having the police come by and tell them to stay with you, whatever form, that affected people's willingness to take the chance. And it wasn't until CORE and SNCC and SCLC kind of got together and began to canvass in those areas and tell them, look, you're supposed to have the right to vote. It's being denied you, and don't give up on it because we're here to help you get it. Once they saw that, and that there were people in the North that were coming down South to take an interest in have that opportunity, the whole picture changed. That movement came under attack from the branches of the government, like the FBI and so forth, headed by J. Edgar Hoover, who had a list already made up of several thousand people that needed to be put in jail. That's what you measure him by.
In view of the fact that the executive assistant of Martin Luther King is a self-admitted Communist Party member, I think that that would certainly justify the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee to look into the situation in Birmingham, look into those racial disturbances which have occurred in our city, and see if there may not be some subversive background or some subversive motive to the overall situation which exists in that city.
President Kennedy had asked for a meeting at the White House with the 5 civil rights organizations that were going to have a march on Washington. And his point was to ask them to call off the march. In other words, he was preoccupied with other things regarding the Cold War, and civil rights was something that he was in favor of, but he didn't want to interrupt the process that he was in already. And the idea here it was also that he really was concerned that the civil rights movement was going to make it difficult for him to win a second term. Because after all, if he was forced to deliver some civil rights legislation, he would lose the South. But before the march, while they were there, he took Dr. King out on the White House lawn to have a word with him, and he said, "You got to get rid of Odell and Stanley Levison, because it's understood that they're communists." So Dr. King's response was, as he reported back to us, he said, "Well, I don't know how Jack could be a communist because he got 2 jobs with me. I was the only person on the staff that had 2 full-time responsibilities, Kennedy just kind of dismissed it. Well, be that as it may, I'm making this request simply because you're going to want my support. And I'll be in, if you can't get rid of these comments, it's implied that I can't be supportive of civil rights.
When it became evident last May in Birmingham that the crusade for civil rights had reached the conscience of America, and that Mr. Odell's employment by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference could be used against the organization by segregationists and race baiters, it was mutually agreed that Mr. Odell should terminate his employment with us. This was done at a meeting in New York on June 26.
Well, so we held a meeting at the hotel in New York a couple of weeks later to decide how to respond to this. And I think that it was generally conceded that it would be better for me to go.
As I said before, it is my firm belief that this issue of Mr. Odell is only another attempt to forestall and hamper the true essence of today's civil rights struggle.
And then it was about that time that Freedom Ways again asked me would not join their staff. So by December, I was ready to go into that. I mean, my first article in Freedom Ways was in the fall of 1963, where I picked up on Dr. King's the first thing he said at the March on Washington. People have been waiting all day, and he knew it. And he said, "Why are we here?" He said, "I know that's what you've been waiting to hear, and we're here because America has issued a bad check." He said, "There's no money in the Bank of Justice. We don't accept that." So I took that quote from him and developed an article on the position of the black community in the South, the Negro people in the South, and how we were not only disfranchised, we didn't have, our income was affected seriously. And that was my first article in the fall of 1963. In 1968, I lived in New York, and Freedom was published in New York, and I was delivering Freedom Ways to a black bookstore in Harlem, 125th Street. And the lady saw me coming and came to the door, and she said, "Dr. King's been shot." And this was about 6 o'clock in the evening. "He's been shot." I said, where was he?" "Jack, he's been shot in Memphis." I said, "Oh, man." And she met me at the door again and said, "Jack, he's dead." So, it takes a minute or so to digest that. The doctor, I said, no, you can. He said, no, he's dead, Jack." I said, "Okay." Well, it's something that it takes time to register. It's like you heard it, but whoa.
Swing low.
And then people start coming out into the street, like in one way demonstrating and in another way grieving. It took time to register the trauma that it represented. Then people started taking to the streets, and then it had been, outbreaks of, stones being thrown through windows and people protesting. But that really, it's not going to bring him back. In the period when you're trying to transform a long-standing public policy, there is no safe place. There's no such thing as a safe place. Maybe out of the country, but that, you know, and so it just means anybody could get killed anywhere simply because it's the issue that's at stake. The purpose of the assassination is to so terrify the population that they will give up the effort. And we were determined that that effort was not going to give up because we weren't demanding anything that we were not entitled to. The United States is 5% of the world's population, and we have 25% of the prison population of the world. There's something wrong with that, man. Wait a minute. Is that the definition of freedom? Is that the definition of democracy? Is that what it means, the world's leading democracy? We are 5% of the population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. You can just take that one statistic and build a case for fundamental change. If we didn't want to do anything but change that relationship, that would be the first stage of a social revolution. To anyone who wants to examine them, that America is a police state. And you could say, well, that's just for black folk. Well, but we are here like everybody else is. If it's not, well, what would you call a police state? One that it could happen to blacks but didn't happen to whites? I mean, what would be the basis for that dichotomy? It's a police state. Because behind this, the police are not paying any price. But if they put them, if they're even called to account, they're retired, and and get a bonus. And well, you can't be on this because it's an embarrassment. But here is your settlement. Stop and frisk has to do with the police relation with the African American community. We're the ones that get stopped and frisked, but nobody should. This is ridiculous. I mean, you can't be walking down the street and the police stop you just because they want to find out something about you and find out who you are on what basis. That's self-evident. And when they stop and then frisk and then shoot you, that kind of underlines it, doesn't it? If we're not guessing at what this is criminal behavior by the police. Now, how many of them have had to stand trial for anything? And when this can happen to one person, it can happen to 100. Because, I mean, if it's not dealt with, it's like a disease that spreads. It's a set of assumptions that the police have that they can stop any black person they want to and frisk them. On what basis? It's like saying, yeah, we can get away with this in your face, you know what I mean? And so Black Lives Matter is an attempt to set forward a counter narrative. And it challenges the idea of how much progress we've made. 40 years after we got a Civil Rights Act and so forth, says no segregation and so forth, the mentality of the police and other forces is still grounded in the idea that they can, that black lives don't matter. And that's why you have our youth putting up a demonstration based upon that principle. Black lives matter. The country has to be reminded of that, notwithstanding the changes that have taken place. And that's a very sobering development. I think it's a process, but I don't think blacks feel comfortable that it has changed because you don't know where it's going to break out. It's like an epidemic, so you catch it one place and it breaks out someplace else. So that's why the necessity to continue to protest is extremely important. So Black Lives Matter is a shorthand for this is an insult that we're faced with, and the police activities are a violation of our constitutional rights. Black Lives Matter, sir, it's very polite, but it has to be said, and the fact that it has to be said is the problem. It obviously is catching hold in the country. We take a language that is aimed at calling attention to this. And the fact you have to call attention to the life of a black person is a statement on the state of the union. We struggle for democracy, and that's a good thing. But we have to be able to measure when we have achieved it and how, or not, and how much further we have to go. American society has lost much of its hopefulness. People have spent time and money trying to get a degree in college, and they can't find a job. There are millions of people who are living on welfare, and it's being cut in so many places. Social action helps to bring moral progress. That's why it's so valuable. That's why it's so necessary. The moral progress doesn't come from just keep on sleeping and then you'll suddenly change. Mm-hmm. It comes from activity that's thoughtful and committed, and people come to see the stake that they have in it, and that's the moral progress that takes place.
We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. The union is behind us. We shall not be moved. The union is behind us. We shall not be moved like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. Fighting for our freedom, we shall not be moved. Fighting for our freedom, we shall not be moved like a tree that's planted by the water. We